suppose you could say I have overall strategic oversight of this project, as well as our other ongoing cataloguing projects, and also our engagement and partnership work, which we're going to be talking about a little bit more later. I would like to completely embarrass Emma, one of our senior archivists, who's sitting up there trying to look incognito. She's project managed this work in a much more on-the-ground way, sharing her unparalleled expertise in archive cataloguing, and we're really grateful for all her support over the last year or so. And you'll be hearing from Alex in a bit, who has spent the last year with the fantastic job title of John Addington Symonds Project Archivist. From Monday morning at 9 o'clock, he will be physics archivist. That is the versatility of us archivists. So Alex is going to be doing most of the exciting show and tell bits today. I don't have very many slides. So how do I make this work, Lily? While I talk, I'm going to treat you to a lovely image of this room in days gone by. Does that work? Yeah, there we go. Brilliant.
I might need to do the slides. I don't know if this is working.
That's fine. Okay. So yeah, this is this room in 1911, when it was the reading room of the Bristol Medical School Library. So you can just enjoy that for a bit. And this lecture date has fallen at a really great time for us, as Andrew said, because literally in the last couple of months, the recataloguing of Symonds papers has been completed, which is why we're taking this opportunity to tell you a bit more about the archive. And so we thought it might be interesting not just to do a bit of a show and tell about Symonds and the collection itself and tell you about his life, but also to shine a bit of a light on the kind of backroom work of how we manage and approach these types of projects, what some of the issues are that we have to grapple with, and how the world of archives is constantly changing and adapting as the world around us changes. So I'm going to kick off today by giving a bit of background to the project. Then Alex is going to talk and share some of his experiences of the work itself and some more about Symonds. And then we're going to talk about the engagement work, which is yet to come, and hopefully we'll be bringing in some of your feedback at some point too. So one of the big challenges about this collection, which Alex is going to discuss in more detail, is that it came into special collections in no less than 47 separate deposits over a 54-year period. And that meant that the catalogue had grown a bit like a spider plant, if you could. Here we go. Not a picture of a spider plant, sorry. I know I made it sound like that was going to be a picture of a spider plant. But this is the original catalogues, dating from, I think, the 50s, maybe, on that lovely old kind of folio manila paper. And most of that cataloguing took place before the advent of modern cataloguing standards, way before the advent of online catalogues. So it wasn't really fit for purpose. As you can see, it's literally like someone's opened a box, taken out the first thing and written it down, which is a world away from the kind of hierarchical cataloguing and whatever, and, you know, access points and whatever that we would aim to do today. So that was what we had up until a year or so ago. And this was where we were extremely fortunate to receive a bequest from someone who's a huge Symonds fan to fund the work on making the collection more accessible and discoverable. And the reason this was so significant, which surprises a lot of people, is that Special Collections and Theatre Collection, our lovely sister collection in the university, both have no core cataloguers on the staff. Every project like this has to be individually fundraised for, with varying degrees of success. So for all of you who use archives, next time you get frustrated that you want to access an uncatalogued collection, that's the context. And yeah, so that's a reason to kind of blame austerity and not us. But we were even more fortunate in this case that the bequest was large enough to include funds for engagement work on the collection. And that's the point at which we contacted OutStories, partly because I knew they'd already done work on Symonds and had some. There we go, that's an example of the work on Symonds, and had a lot of real expertise among their members, some of whom are here today, which is brilliant. The expertise, not just members of OutStories, but also because we have such a huge variety of archives in our care, right across, you know, politics, science, as I've said, literature. And we're not arrogant enough to assume that we know more about the kind of engagement that different communities want to have with those archives than the communities themselves do. So that's why we try to involve other people as far as we can, and we'll be coming back to that in a bit more detail later. So we had the money for the cataloguing and for some engagement work. Good. But the next challenge, which represents a huge change in archival practice over the years, is how we approach working on collections like these, which either contain sensitive material or relate to minoritised groups or both. Back when I was in archive school, quite a few years ago, we were still mainly being taught that the job of an archivist was to be neutral. We put the records out there and people can come and use them and interpret them from their own standpoints, but the records themselves and their journey into the public domain is neutral. This was starting, even then, to be countered by what came to be known as the postmodern approach to archive theory. And for those who are interested in following this up from an academic perspective, I'm not going to go any deeper right now, but I would recommend an article, I'm going to click that on, called Two Archival Canons by James Lappin, which takes an interesting look at different interpretations of the concept of archive neutrality for anyone who does want to go a bit deeper. But for those working on the ground in archives like special collections, I think it's fair to say that it took a lot of people far too long to realise that, for example, a profession where 97% of the UK workforce are white can't ever be neutral. All of us bring our lived experience, education, backgrounds, everything else to the work we do. And if a range of people aren't doing the work, then a range of voices can never properly represent the contents of the records themselves. So concepts like the activist archivist, meaning an archivist who actively challenges the idea of neutrality in order to achieve social justice goals, were being mooted as early as the 1970s, but didn't really gain much traction until the last 15 or so years, I think it's fair to say. During this time, there's been increasing emphasis on uncovering hidden histories, of archivists actively seeking to counterbalance the status quo that history tends to be written by the winners, by foregrounding stories which give voice to the minoritised and the oppressed, and giving opportunities for archive users to explore the experiences of women or queer people or people of colour or people with disabilities through those people's own words. And as well as through engagement work, which we're going to come back to later, we do this by examining our collection development policies to try and see what gaps exist in our holdings and how we could try to fill them. This includes considering how we could fill gaps where written records might not exist because it wasn't always safe for people to write things down that could be used in evidence against them, or because they concern cultures where an oral tradition was the primary means of storytelling. We also recatalogue collections that were catalogued in times past, as we're doing here, to change the outdated language used in descriptions and/or to give additional detail to help people studying fields like Black history or gender studies or queer history that didn't exist as disciplines when the records were taken into our custody. And the other big recataloguing project we've been undertaking this year, and Ella in the front row has done some amazing work on this, is the papers of the Pinney family, who lived in what is now the council's Georgian House Museum and own plantations on Nevis worked by enslaved people. And that project is also funded by a philanthropic gift. But there has also been a justifiable anger that people sometimes blithely talk about hidden histories as if hiding history is just a case of benign neglect, rather than, as one Twitter user put it, they're only hidden because somebody hid them. Sometimes this anger is directed at archivists who are painted as gatekeepers, presumably because that's kind of more dramatic than people that are trying to do their best with ever decreasing resources. Is it working? Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe I'm just not pressing hard enough. So what is the relevance of all this to the Symonds collection and other collections we hold which contain queer narratives or stories about the lives of minoritised people? The answer is that we know we have ground to make up in terms of getting some of these stories into the public domain. And we've done a few things like this little online exhibit that we put together for LGBTQ History Month last year. But this work can have real challenges. A couple of examples from the Symonds collection in particular is that what is considered acceptable behaviour in language changes hugely throughout the generations. And some of Symonds's interests in Greek love, for example, stray into territory which could now be considered grooming. And for those of you who were at this lecture last year, Sam Rutherford gave an excellent and thought-provoking overview of the complexities of Symonds being so far ahead of his time in his openness about homosexuality, but so very much of his time in some of his views on women and on working class people. And I know both these issues have been very much at the forefront of Alex's mind as he's been cataloguing the collection. Another development in the archive sector over the last 10 or so years has been the notion that we have a duty of care both to our users and indeed to our staff when we're dealing with sensitive material in archives. We clearly don't want to censor material, but content warnings have become a far more common sight on the pages of archive catalogues, as we aim to give our users an informed choice about the material they may be about to encounter. We've had to grapple with this a lot with some of our other collections, like the Pinney Papers, which contain frequent references to enslaved people. And our response has been to produce a set of guidelines for sensitive cataloguing to ensure that we have consistency between different staff when it comes to considerations such as preferred terminology. And those guidelines are very much a work in progress, but always really open to feedback and to changing them as things change in the world. And we're looking to expand these guidelines when we move on to our next cataloguing project, which involves the papers of a trans woman. And we're intending to work with OutStories and other organisations for some advice and guidance on that. Something else that's important to consider when working with the archives of queer people is that sometimes detail has been left out of the written record for their own protection, which then throws up the issue of to what extent is it the job of the cataloguing archivist to highlight these absences or to suggest where an absence might exist where it equally may not exist. And there can be a lot of nuance involved. There's no one size fits all. So it is difficult, but I know Alex is going to pick up on that in his section of the talk. So I hope that served as a bit of an introduction and a window into our little world. And now I'm going to hand over to Alex so that he can talk to you about his cataloguing work and his things.
This was working now.
Yeah, it is. Well, yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Perfect. Great. Thank you, Nikki, for that really fabulous introduction to the project. And yeah, really just to echo what Nikki said, thank you all for coming today, not just to celebrate Symonds' 185th birthday tomorrow, but to learn more about what we've been doing in the archive to make these papers more accessible to a diverse range of audiences and some of the future engagement plans that we're going to have planned for the next few months and into next year. So while I'm sure many in the audience are familiar to some extent with John Addington Symonds, I thought it would be a good idea to provide a little summary on his life, just in case people aren't aware. There is one thing I want to mention, though, that in some of the slides there is information pertaining to content warnings. There's one image that might be deemed a little bit offensive, just as a preface. So yeah, getting on to Symonds. So he was born in 1840 in Bristol to an upper middle class family. His father was also named John Addington Symonds, which has been a bit of a challenge in the archive when cataloguing and differentiating between which one is which. Symonds Jr. was educated at Harrow School. He excelled.
Could you slow down, please?
Oh, yeah, sure. Sorry. I'm not a very good public talker, so I'll try and slow down. Yeah, so he was educated at Harrow School, where he excelled academically. But his time there was kind of stymied because he had a lot of issues with the discomforts. At this stage in his life, he was still quite unwell. He was a frail man, well, frail teenager at that point. And he said actually in his memoirs that life at Harrow was not only uncongenial to my tastes and temperament, it was clearly unwholesome. So he had lots of issues there, maybe a little bit pretentious. When he finished his time at Harrow, he went on to Balliol College at Oxford, and he was under the tutorage of the classical scholar Benjamin Jowett. He became a very distinguished student at Oxford and enjoyed his time there. He met, for the first time in his life, lots of like-minded people, although he was still exacerbated by constant eye inflammation. And a few years afterwards, he was diagnosed, sadly, with the condition that would end his life, tuberculosis, which was a pretty bad condition for everyone in the 19th century. So it was at this point that Symonds turned his back on a potential career in law in London. And following the advice from his specialists and family, they decided that writing was a viable career choice for him. It was something that wouldn't be too strenuous on his, at the time, weak constitution. So during the 1870s, Symonds wrote with frequency, and he published on a variety of topics, including the Greek poets, travel books on Italy and Greece, where he loved traveling, and he began writing his really prodigious study on the cultural history of the Renaissance in Italy. We've got copies in the archive, and it's huge. It's 7 volumes. The manuscripts are endless. So in between traveling and writing, Symonds married Janet Catherine North in 1864. She was the sister of botanical artist and world traveller Marianne North. I don't know if anyone's been to Kew Gardens in London, but they've got the Marianne North Gallery there, which is really fabulous. They had 4 children together, 2 of whom are on the screen, Margaret and Catherine. They both went on to have really interesting careers. So Margaret published several books, one in collaboration with her father on their family life in the Swiss Alps in 1893. And then just a few months before she died in 1925, she published a biography on her father. So Catherine, she was the longest lived Symonds daughter, and she became a really influential nursing and military administrator. She led the British Red Cross Voluntary Aid Detachment Force during the First World War and served as the inaugural director of the Women's Royal Naval Service. And we're really lucky to say that at Bristol University, we also have Catherine's personal papers, which have been semi-catalogued, but hopefully in the future there's some money to have them catalogued because they're a really fabulous collection. So now onto the Davos years, where John Addington Symonds and his family relocated to Switzerland. So this was quite a defining point in his career because he was pretty sick at this point, and upon the advice of specialists and families, he relocated to Switzerland following a really violent hemorrhage. The alpine town of Davos was an ideal place because it had a really good microclimate set in a high valley, and he settled there permanently in 1880. Davos was then a pretty isolated community in the Swiss Alps. It wasn't what it is now, which was like a fashionable Swiss town. It was nestled in the valleys of the Swiss Alps, and people only really went there if they were like diseased with some pulmonary disorder. So it was a good place for him to go, bless him with his poor lungs. The problem is, though, here, he didn't have access to the metropolitan lifestyle that he had in England, with its easy access to libraries and archives and intellectuals to stimulate his curious mind. But when he was there, he tried to cultivate a new life for himself. So he engaged himself with the local community, and he became president of the winter sports and toboggan clubs, even though he involved himself very little physically in either of these. He thoroughly enjoyed watching the very attractive, muscular Swiss men perform. So it was very good from that perspective. This leads on actually to his association with the Ball family. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that perfectly right. He essentially encouraged and financially supported their hotelier business that was struggling at the time. We think this was influenced by his companionship with Christian Ball, who was an athletic 19-year-old man that Symonds became really utterly infatuated with. And he accompanied the family on their travels. Not quite sure how his wife felt about that when all these men were accompanying them on travels back and forth to England and also around continental Europe as well. There we go. So this is actually the Symonds family home in Davos, which partly still stands today. I found it on Google Maps. I think it's been turned into like apartments, but it's still kind of got a similar-ish exterior. But yeah, interior photos of Amhof really reveal a beautifully furnished home that Symonds had built in 1881, really displays the discerning taste of the Symonds family, and interestingly to point out about his library. It was of great importance to him because most of his books were either brought over from England or were purchased and or gifted and arrived via post. In Davos, Symonds had no continuous access to libraries, and he really relied on creating his own academic environment at his new home. But he did visit some of his more cosmopolitan friends abroad. He regularly visited Janet Ann Ross. She was a historian based in Florence, and he made use of the archives there when he was researching the life of Michelangelo. In Davos, Symonds was also really ferociously productive with his writing. He published biographies on Ben Jonson, Sir Philip Sidney, Walt Whitman, and again, wrote articles, poetry, and translations. So he was very much keeping himself busy. Unfortunately, with Symonds, though, at this time in the 1880s, it was constantly an unrelenting battle between his scholarly output and his episodes of really debilitating illness. So there were lots of periods in the 1880s where he was really incapable of working, and he couldn't get out and enjoy the natural world as much as he'd like to. Symonds' homosexuality, however, was central to his existence as an individual and as a writer. He recognised, though, that writing on these subjects might stray into transgressive themes of same-sex activity that was not only dangerous, but punishable by law under the Offences Against the Person Act 1861 and the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. Though his pioneering work on same-sex love was very much inspired from an early age with his interest in ancient Greek literature that sort of shaped his perception on same-sex desire, particularly Plato's Symposium, which he read for the first time, I think either at the end of Harrow School or when he started at Balliol College. In Symonds's now famous memoirs that are held at the London Library, he writes that these classical texts allowed him to form himself into a literary being with an absorbing passion for persons of his own sex. Fun technology. There we go. Throughout Symonds's literature, he struggled with the topical question of whether same-sex desire was entirely congenital or whether it could be the result of societal influence. Given the breadth of research on this subject, I'm an archivist, not an academic, so I'll leave that to them to mull over in more deeper discussion. Though I do believe it pertinent for me to mention just several of Symonds's major treatises on same-sex love that were privately printed and circulated among a small cohort of his trusted friends. A Problem in Greek Ethics, which is displayed here on the PowerPoint, was written roughly around 1871 and then privately printed in 10 editions in 1883. It examined male homosexual relationships in ancient Greece. It includes pederasty, offering a perspective on how far same-sex desire was tolerated and sometimes valued as a sort of heroic masculine love in ancient Greece. A Problem in Modern Ethics was written in 1889 and printed privately in 1891. And this delves into the complex of nature of sexual inversion, one of the several terms used in the 19th century to describe homosexuality. Symonds wrote this text from a medical and philosophical perspective, intending to sort of legitimize same-sex desire as a natural phenomenon, void of any of the prejudice often associated with contemporary Christian culture in the 19th century England. In the 1890s, Symonds collaborated with physician and sexologist Havelock Ellis, though they never met in person. They corresponded for roughly 7 or 8 years whilst he was living in Switzerland. And they worked together on the first medical textbook on homosexuality, titled Sexual Inversion. This was the first of 7 volumes that would make up Ellis's Psychology and Sex series. It was an interesting blend that combined Symonds's historic analysis with Ellis's medical and scientific theory on homosexuality. Symonds's A Problem in Greek Ethics was included as an appendix in the first edition. In the archive, we hold typescript transcript correspondence between Symonds and Ellis, discussing all aspects of their project. And it makes for really enlightening reading, given their different views and perspectives, and sometimes almost little small arguments they would have on what to include. And Symonds was very keen that his name should come before Havelock Ellis's in the published edition, though it never did because he died beforehand. So Havelock got the last word on that. Symonds died, sadly, in April 1893, before he could see the publication of Sexual Inversion. It was published in 1896 in Germany first, owing to the moral climate in England following Oscar Wilde's conviction. And then it was published in England the following year in 1897. Symonds's literary executor, Horatio Forbes Brown, and members of the Symonds family bought up and destroyed many copies of the first edition in a sort of vain attempt to protect his name and his posthumous reputation. The text was published again in October 1897 without Symonds's name mentioned at all, and without his Greek studies essay as an appendix. Unfortunately, though, in 1898, both English editions were banned in England as obscene following the Bedborough trial. Okay. So Symonds's relationships with men are always a fun subject. They were often transactional in nature. In 1881, he met Angelo Fossato, a very dashing Venetian gondolier who was in a heterosexual relationship and a father to 2 sons. Symonds was besotted by the striking beauty of Fossato and describes him in great detail in his memoirs, in his letters, and in his poetry. Fossato and his wife Maria entered the employment of the Symonds family and accompanied them to Switzerland, traveling back and forth between England and the continent, and Angelo became Symonds's personal gondolier on a fixed salary. Fossato really was an indispensable presence in Symonds's life, with the latter referring to him in an 1891 letter to Janet Ann Ross as a spoiled and indispensable servant. The nature of their arrangement transcended sort of traditional employer and employee relationships. Fossato accompanied Symonds to music halls and fashionable restaurants in London. They shared each other's bed, and he was really his object of unwavering affection for 12 years, and he was present at Symonds's deathbed in Rome in 1893. Symonds paraded these handsome working class men that really relied on him financially at social engagements. Although Fossato benefited from his association with Symonds, there were always undertones of exploitation and a bit of objectification. The difference in class was made really clear in a letter from Symonds to his daughter Margaret in 1892. On a visit to the Tennyson family in Surrey, Symonds instructed Fossato to stay outside in the garden shrubbery while the others went inside to meet Hallam and Lord Tennyson. But later in the visit, Symonds was instructed to bring Fossato inside to greet members of the family, while apparently dressed very handsomely in a gondolier costume. So it seems as if he was being a bit showed off. Similar exploitation can be said of a young man called Edwin Bruger, who was instructed by Symonds to call on his friend Charles Keynes Jackson when he was visiting London in June 1892. Symonds writes that Bruger is a good specimen of Swiss looks and quotes a friend who said, "You do not feel the beauty of a nation until you have slept with them." From this, we may interpret that Bruger had been instructed to offer sexual favours to Keynes Jackson upon his visit in London, but though we can't say for sure, but yeah, it can be inferred, sadly. Right, so just moving on to the cataloguing aspect now of the project. The project to recatalogue Symonds' papers commenced last year, and I've finished the final touches in July of this year. So I feel really lucky to have spent 10 months working with such an exciting and diverse collection, created not just by John Addington Symonds, but members of his immediate family, including his wife Janet Catherine and his daughters Margaret, Catherine, Charlotte, and Janet. What makes this archive unique is that it is very much a family archive, and it encompasses the histories of the women closest to Symonds throughout his life. So we've got the papers also, as I mentioned earlier, of his daughter Catherine, but also of his daughter Margaret. The collection is prodigious in size. It's roughly 34 standard archive boxes, and it includes extensive correspondence, literary papers, really beautifully vibrant scrapbooks, and we've got one on display here afterwards, family photographs, printed books. As Nikki mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the collection came to special collections in many different deposits and from several different descendants of Symonds. So from a cataloguing perspective, this raised a lot of issues. Each deposit was accessioned with a unique number, and several of these deposits didn't even have numbers at all. So it was a bit confusing trying to arrange it all. Without boring you all with archival theory, though, and cataloguing guidelines, I had to essentially amalgamate roughly 50 accession numbers into one cataloguing number. So yeah, that was a lot of work. There are really two sides to the cataloguing process, though, because once it had been catalogued, it was a case of trying to rearrange physically the entire archive, which was in a very sort of haphazard state. It was dispersed amongst old boxes, flimsy folders, all that sort of stuff. So it was a real feat to try and gather that all together. But now the archive is stored in an air-conditioned repository, and the temperature and humidity are monitored for stability to prevent any further degradation. And it is also important to note that the preservation sort of transcends traditional just repackaging and reboxing. So one item that we couldn't bring today because it was too large was a very large scrapbook that was compiled by Margaret Symonds. This has now been fully digitized and is accessible on the archive catalogue, so you can look at every individual page and there's a digital image of that. And that was thanks to our in-house digitization officer, Jamie. But really, as archivists, we're constantly balancing the sort of needs for preservation and access needs to archives as well. So by providing digital surrogates, we can protect the fragile material from further degradation by really handling them on fewer occasions. This thing does not like that. There we go. So recataloguing archives allows us to survey material for potentially sensitive and or offensive content that we would want the public to be made aware of before accessing the catalogue. This was a concern, as Nikki mentioned also earlier, that was discussed prior to the project, given Symonds's interest in same-sex advocacy that was influenced by ancient Greek models of sexuality, which did include pederastic relationships. And the power dynamics of this type are never egalitarian, sometimes platonic, but there's always a senior male initiating a relationship with a younger male. In the Symonds archive are photographs taken by German photographers Wilhelm von Gloden and his cousin Guglielmo Plucho, both known for their nude photographs of young Mediterranean men. Given the challenges in discerning the ages of these models, content warnings will be made clear on the online catalogue that could be potentially offensive, considering that they are nude. With any personal papers, there will inevitably be gaps in the historical record, and this is no different for Symonds. Upon his death in 1893, Symonds left his literary estate to his close friend Horatio Forbes Brown, and Brown published the first biography of Symonds in 1895, and later his letters and papers in 1925, just before his own death. Symonds's sexuality was suppressed in both publications to avoid scandal and to protect his reputation, as was also stressed by his widow. So Janet Catherine Symonds wrote to their mutual friend, Henry Sidgwick, that I trust Horatio fully to publish these books and want to help, but I want to hinder him, as you well know. Upon Brown's death in 1926, Symonds's memoirs were entrusted to Edmund Gosse and Charles Hagberg Wright, and they both worked at the London Library, where the manuscript remains today. The memoirs were put under a 50-year embargo, and they were sealed in a green cardboard box following a codicil dated December 1925. Unfortunately, with this, many of the additional papers that Brown also gave to the London Library, per his instructions in his will, including letters by Symonds, an autograph book, diaries, were all destroyed by Gosse and Hagberg Wright. A memorandum by Catherine Firth, one of his youngest daughter, on the search for her father's papers confirms this following her journey to gain access to her father's memoirs, which was a decades-long battle, and she was only granted access in 1939. Thankfully, though, we still have a wealth of material created by Symonds available to us here at Bristol and at other repositories nationally and internationally, including the British Library, King's College, Cambridge, the Bodleian at Oxford, and Yale University in the US. I think that's it.